Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, to President George Sampao, Professor Jane Den Hollander, the Vice-Chancellor of Deakin University. I think my friend and parliamentary colleague, Maria van Buckenu, is here this morning. Good to see you, Maria. I also wish to acknowledge Ahmed Fahour, if he is here with us, and if he's not, then he has failed in his first function as my representative to the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. So he gets marked down on his report card. But I'm sure he'll be here in the subsequent days. And friends and foes of the Geelong Cats. And if you can't have a Brisbane team in the AFL Grand Final, then you may as well back the Cats. Let me make some remarks about why we are gathered here. In our deeply complex, intertwined and globalised world, understanding is the most valuable currency. Understanding what we all have in common. Understanding where real differences lie. Understanding also how differences are best dealt with. We face complex, even unprecedented challenges in the century which lies before us. But perhaps our biggest challenge is the one it's always been: how to work together rather than how to work against each other. 6 years ago, conscious of the threat posed by polarisation between our societies and cultures, Spanish Prime Minister Zapatero and Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan co-sponsored the Alliance of Civilizations initiative through the United Nations General Assembly. Their desire, given momentum and shape through the Alliance of Civilizations, was to fight the extremism that has so torn us in recent years. As an initiative, it's important, particularly given the challenges since 2001, particularly in the relationship between the West and Islam. There has been a widely held view that our religious and cultural differences would become the fundamental cause of future conflict. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations has certainly had a lot of airplay in recent years, particularly in the wake of September 11. Of course, there have been conflicts: the Crusades, the conquest, the reconquest of Spain, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the siege of Vienna in 1683. These are part of history. They are there for us all to reflect upon. But conflict has not always been the only story. The truth is there has also been a deep history of philosophical, scientific and economic interaction between our civilizations, between our religious traditions, a tradition of conversation, of dialogue, of mutual discovery. Over time, as cultural boundaries shifted, expanded and contracted, the norms, mores and thinking of the various peoples of the book have shaped each other. Cultural adaptation and adoption, the sharing of art, of architecture, design, science, alphabets, mathematics, trade and legal systems. John Esposito, for example, has written, and I quote him, "Like other faiths, Islam incorporated elements of the legal systems it encountered, those of Christianity, those of Judaism, those of Zoroastrianism. Administrative practices were absorbed from the Byzantine and Persian empires, while Greek science, philosophy and arts were adopted across much of the known world. Drawing as it does on the common Abrahamic heritage, Islam, through much of its history, has seen Jews and Christians as protected peoples, and in some periods of coexistence, tolerance has been a strong force. Of course, there have also been many examples of the reverse, and these cannot simply be airbrushed from history. We should not be naive about this. But for example, in the last 250 years of the first millennium, as Al-Andalus, Spain was Islamic. There were, of course, tensions and conflict between the different faiths. This is a matter of historical record and of war. But Esposito has pointed to the inclusive nature of the political culture of the time in certain key respects. Christians, for example, were able to serve in prominent positions in the caliph's court, even as diplomats. Particularly in the upper parts of society, cross-cultural intercourse was strong. Esposito points to Christians and Arabs adopting names in parts of each other's culture. In the 12th century, Toledo was a major centre for scholars across Europe, particularly translators working between Arabic, Greek and Hebrew. They founded what became known as the Toledo School of Translators, and so began an experiment in cross-cultural coexistence, cohabitation and understanding that lasted decades. Some of the more important texts were translated from one culture to another: Ptolemy, Archimedes, Euclid. Aristotle became known in the West through Avicenna's Arabic translations. Advanced scientific work by Arabic scientists in astronomy and in medicine and other fields made their way into Castilian and other languages of Europe. Jewish translators also played a significant role in this. On one level, the Toledo School represented an extraordinary example of pluralism, an example of coexistence over periods of decades. But it has also led to a flowering of European thought as Arabic material itself was translated into the languages of Europe. Here was real philosophical and cultural common ground, science in the service of man and all under one God. President Obama touched on this truth in his famous speech in Cairo only a couple of years ago. And I quote him. He said, "It was Islam and places like Al-Azhar that carried the light of learning through so many centuries, paving the way for Europe's Renaissance and Enlightenment. Throughout history, Islam has demonstrated through words and deeds the possibilities of religious tolerance and racial equality." The legacy of the Muslim era in Spain and elsewhere in Southern Europe is part of an inheritance of knowledge and scholarship for which we in the West have also benefited. Muslim societies have had economic and scientific dominance in ages past, including under the Ottoman Empire. More recently, so too has the West. Nonetheless, with some notable modern exceptions, democracy was historically rarely a feature of Muslim or Islamic countries. But contrary to the views of some populist commentators, democracy can and does flourish in Muslim-majority countries such as Indonesia, Turkey, and prospectively Egypt, the country which some call the mother of the world. These same commentators portray Islamic cultures as being at odds with Western cultures and values. Those differences, real and perceived, have been, of course, exacerbated by the terrorist attacks of September 11. The perpetrators of 9/11 did not represent authentic Islam. They were instead nothing more than a terror gang of transnational criminals operating under the guise of Islam, a profound distortion of the Islamic faith. And they continue to distort that faith for their own narrow Islamist agenda. For all of us, 9/11 was a fundamentally jarring event. It forced many people to grapple with Islamic identity for the first time, to ask questions about the relationship between these different cultures and faiths, and whether these differences were in fact reconcilable. In this country, Australia, a nation on the edge of Asia with Western and Indigenous heritage, we have sought to build a society where people from a range of cultural backgrounds live their lives on the basis of tolerance, using dialogue to resolve our differences. And against all global measures, Australia has been a remarkably successful venture. We have Muslim neighbours to our north, such as Indonesia and Malaysia, countries with whom we are working closely together on common security challenges, including fighting and working to avert jihadist terrorist attacks and more broadly to deal with militant Islam. Harmony between civilizations is not only for us a feel-good policy for Australia, it is also equally in our hard national interests, dictated by basic geographical reality, to counter terrorism, also to do business with some of the fastest growing economies in the world. It would not be in Australia's strategic or economic interest to fall for the simplified argument that our different cultures and faiths cannot work together. They can. This has never been a credible option for Australia, nor has it been in our nature as Australians, given our enormously diverse origins. Look at the extraordinary diversity of our region: Buddhist Thailand, Muslim Indonesia and Malaysia, Hindu India, Christian Philippines, Confucian Singapore. And within these countries, there are significant, of course, religious minorities. Because of Australia's combined global and regional interests, we have no interest whatsoever in religious and cultural differences and conflict escalating out of control. Calmer voices are often needed in the region and in the world, and we hope to be able to provide one together with our other partners in the international community. It is in all of our interest, therefore, to draw out those histories and traditions of dialogue rather than those of conflict. Again, we cannot ignore the fact that differences and disagreements do exist. That would be naive. But we can choose, and I emphasize the word choose, to define our interfaith and intercultural relationships in a way that serves our common goals, not the goals of those who seek to sow discord. There is often an assumption in the West that Islam has a homogeneous political and cultural identity. That is simply not the case. It doesn't stand the test of the historical record. As noted already, there are militant Islamists who seek to use jihad to repel the infidel and to build a new Muslim caliphate. But the majority of the world's Muslims now, in fact, live in countries where modern democracy has become or is becoming the norm. Turkey has become a robust democracy. Indonesia, a country of profound diversity and faith, has undergone an epic democratic transformation. And that is before we even begin to talk about the events of the recent Arab Spring. Australia has been a close and admiring partner of Indonesia in this evolution and in building tolerance, trust and understanding across our wider region. President Yudhoyono said this in Riyadh in 2006, and I quote him, "I do not believe that a clash of civilizations between Islam and the West is inevitable. But I also believe that Islam and the West will not automatically and effortlessly get along in perfect harmony. For that to happen, we need to build bridges and to promote mutual understanding." In his bestseller, No God But God, Risa Aslan has written recently that there is an Islamic Reformation currently underway. What shape it will take, we do not yet know, and of course that is a matter for Muslims themselves. But our challenge is to ensure that we continue to hold open dialogue and to work to embrace mutual understanding. The Arab Spring points unquestionably to the universality of values and demonstrates that people's aspirations, no matter which culture they come from, are not fundamentally different. Turkey and Indonesia have already shown that and are profiting from that lesson. French academic Jean-Pierre Filieu argues simply that the Arabs, and I quote him, are no exception. Arabs have been fighting for freedom and self-determination stretching back almost a century. We in the Judeo-Christian West also belong to a tradition of which we are justifiably proud. While we are proud Democrats today, the Judeo-Christian tradition stretching back across the millennia was not intrinsically democratic. Let's acknowledge that fact. But that Judeo-Christian tradition has over time informed the development of our underlying values, which over the centuries found expression through the emerging democratic institutions of what came to be known as the West. So too with the Enlightenment, the celebration of reason, of rational discourse, and the scientific method, and with it certain notions about the place of religion in national democratic governance. Woven together, these threads, our common heritage, our common values, our history of coexistence and interaction, the current socio-political aspirations we can see being played out, these provide a model for our approach to interfaith and intercultural dialogue more broadly. Rather than regard each other as the other, we need to develop a common sense of self. Some of our values, as the Arab Spring has shown, are in fact universal. Pointing to the expression of a secular universalist demand for freedom, dignity and justice across the Middle East this year, again the French academic Jean-Pierre Filieu also says, and I quote him, "Muslims are not only Muslims. That once the fear barrier has been broken down, genuine political and individual self-expression can take place." So in this context, what is to be done? And what can we in Australia do? To start with, Australia is strongly supportive of the Alliance of Civilizations and its focus on fostering mutual respect and understanding among religions and cultures. Australia, we believe, is well placed to promote the AOC in the Asia-Pacific, as we have extensive experience as co-sponsors of regional interfaith dialogues. We also support grassroots interfaith activities in Indonesia and the Philippines. That is, beyond the discourse among elites, to get down to the village level and to get your hands dirty. In our own nation, Australia, we have strong policies of social inclusion, particularly for our diverse migrant and Indigenous communities. We continue to support AOC outreach activities, including a project by 2 Australian universities, La Trobe and Monash, in conjunction with the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies based in Yogyakarta, to hold regional AOC consultations in the Asia-Pacific in order to build awareness and support for what the Alliance seeks to do. More broadly, we'll continue to work on building interfaith dialogue, particularly in our region, but also elsewhere across the world. Australia and Indonesia are the 2 co-founders of the Regional Interfaith Dialogue. We jointly hosted the first meeting in Yogyakarta in 2004, and it has now met since then on 5 separate occasions, including most recently in Perth in Western Australia. The Perth Gathering had a participation of 146 delegates from 14 countries in the region. Discussions focused on resources for teaching youth about other faiths, collecting and disseminating best practice educational interfaith resources, and media training on interfaith questions. Together with Indonesia and our other dialogue co-sponsors, the Philippines and New Zealand, we are planning for the next dialogue to take place early next year. As an outcome of that meeting in Perth, my own department has provided funding to enable a consortium of community organisations led by the Australian Multicultural Foundation to develop a regional interfaith network website designed to engage dialogue partners to continue to interact, exchange ideas and to advertise activities. The website has been active since March this year. We also need to ask ourselves what we will do to manage real differences, religious and cultural, when they arise. We need to work openly and peacefully to resolve points of conflict rather than pretend that they do not exist. We also need to support the economic and political development of the Muslim world. For us in Australia, Afghanistan remains a formidable challenge for us all. One of my most privileged activities recently has been to open a mosque in the middle of Oresgun province, in the middle of Afghanistan, a mosque designed and built by the Australian Defence Force and handed over to local Muslim communities. And we are doing that in many parts of Oresgun and central Afghanistan. It's part of the challenge that we face in order to bring about genuine dialogue between all parties in that strife-torn part of the world. Australia will continue to provide targeted and practical support to the countries in North Africa and the Middle East, particularly Tunisia, Egypt and Libya, as they undertake the difficult task of democratic transformation. Australia is proud to have been the third largest donor of humanitarian assistance to Libya in the world, and we're now providing assistance to our friends in Egypt and Tunisia in the critical tasks of building new democracies, but also in the basic tasks of food security and agricultural productivity to promote stability and to encourage the support of local populations. Australia also, in the past 12 months, through our International Development Assistance budget, has provided $1 billion in assistance to majority Muslim countries across the world. That is what we do on a day-to-day basis across the world. We also need to work to resolve what for too long have been challenges which divide us, such as the Middle East peace process. We in Australia have also deepened our relationship with the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. I had the honour to sign an MOU establishing the Australia-Arab Dialogue with the Arab League Secretary-General on the 21st of September this year. This dialogue will be an important forum through which to foster greater, closer political, economic and cultural links with the Arab world. I've also appointed Australia's first envoy, Ahmed Fahour, to the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation in June this year, when I attended their conference in Astana, in Kazakhstan. Ahmed Fahour accompanied me to that conference. In that role, we will continue to deepen Australia's engagement with OIC countries and, where we can identify appropriate common development projects within the Islamic world, jointly prosecute them. Australia will also take a lead regionally in promoting interfaith dialogue designed to combat fundamentalist religious militancy as part of an intelligent policy response to global terrorism and religious conflict. Australia, coming predominantly from a Christian tradition, but living in a region dominated by the other great faiths of the world, again we believe it is in a good position to do so. We've also committed to host in Australia an international meeting of religious and cultural leaders to break down distrust between Jewish peoples, between Muslims, and between Christians. Of course, we have the next AOC conference in Qatar coming up, in Doha. We plan to co-host at that event with Indonesia and other key AOC partners a ministerial event in the margins to promote interfaith and intercultural activities, recognising the civilisational contributions of the great faiths of the world. We'll also remain steadfast when hard conflict arises. When fundamentalist Islam is invoked in support of violence, suppression or conflict, Australia will always act to defend our values and our interests. And we will also work to tackle difficult questions like the lack of religious freedom in a number of Muslim countries. These are hard questions, but they need to be dealt with. To conclude on a more personal note that gives perhaps those gathered here a small sense of what Australia and the Australian community is doing to build understanding, to break down religious tolerance, let me tell you of some young people I met in Hobart in Tasmania just a few days ago. There was a program in Tasmania, a collaboration between Hobart College and the Tasmanian Centre for Global Learning and the Alosco Foundation, entitled Students Against Racism. Under the project, a group of young Tasmanians who have come to our country under the humanitarian program from countries as diverse as Southern Sudan, Afghanistan and Bhutan share the stories of their arrival here with other schools. And the stories of arrival are often very difficult ones, as people arrive in a foreign country, a foreign culture, with a foreign language, and are simply often expected to get on with it. It's much harder than that, as those in this audience would understand when they have come to this land for the first time themselves, often from cultures which exist beyond what is called the Anglo-Celtic, Anglo-Saxon traditional mainstream of this country. It was moving for me to sit down with these young students, 2 from South Sudan and a young woman from Afghanistan whose name was Vahida. As an Afghan refugee, born in Iran, Vahida felt unwelcome in Tehran, unable to be accepted, but also, frankly, unable to return home. Speaking of that time, of her origins in Afghanistan and Iran, she talks about war, she talks about fighting, she talks about danger, she talks about how she felt in the midst of all of that. She describes her fear and the terrible things she saw trying to escape to Turkey on 2 occasions, which landed her in prison full of refugees and people looking for safety. When she eventually came to Australia, she was struck by how clear our sky was, how clean our environment was, and as a Muslim, how strange it was to be in a country like this. Now she's finding her way, she's happy, she's safe, she's glad to be alive, and we're glad that she's here with us. But what she does through Students Against Racism is this. They go from school to school in Hobart and Tasmania, and now across regional Tasmania, simply telling personal stories of what it's like to come to this country from afar, from a different culture, a different religious tradition, and to explain what it is like dealing at a very personal level with difference. Not all the stories are good. Most of them are. But it is part of deepening a personal level understanding about what it is like to be part of this nation, this diverse nation called Australia. And most importantly, these exchanges at a personal level break down the barriers built by ignorance. Breaking down the barriers built on ignorance is part and parcel of what we seek to do through a program such as that. We in Australia do not hold ourselves up as global exemplars that will be arrogant, proud and just plain wrong. We still have much to do in this country of ours, Australia. But I do believe that we have much to offer the region and the world. I thank you.